Velkommen til dette frokostforedraget med Bioteknologirådet. I dag så har vi fått med oss en veldig spennende gjest. Det er Mareil Kaufmann, som er professor i kriminologi ved Universitetet i Oslo. Og Mareil skal snakke om genetikk, forskning på genetikk og kriminalitet sett i sammenheng. Så det er jo et spennende tema, men veldig vanskelig. Hun skal snakke også om de etiske utfordringene knyttet til den type forskning. Og foredraget i dag vil bli på engelsk. Så da gir jeg egentlig ordet til Mareil. Vær så god.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. I hope everyone hears me well. I'm going to jump right in and with this quote here. Now, a murderer, I believe this, it's in their genes. Anyone here in this room has an idea who could have said this? No? Any guesses? Not really? Huh? Some laughs? Okay. No. Okay, so it's no less than Donald Trump who has said this. So not, he has a pretty powerful position at the moment. And he said that in a podcast in October 2024. Now, what we need to understand here is that where does this go? Well, we don't quite know where he has his inspiration from, but what we need to understand here is the relevance of behavioral genetics. And that's a topic that popped up in Trump's election campaigns in two ways. First and foremost, in the wake of his election campaign in 2020, there was a discussion whether actually politics and our idea about political opinions is influenced by genetics. And the second one is, in 24, there was quite a mix of genetics and right-wing populism in his election campaign. So people with the right genes allegedly vote for Trump. And genes are also what makes Americans great again, and also criminal immigrants worse. So again, we don't know where Trump has his inspiration from. And now sorry, something is going on here. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Okay. But it's easy to co-opt research papers that speak about candidate gene for extreme violent behavior. Scientists actually warn about misconceptions of behavioral genetics. But the language of natural-born killers is in research papers. And biologies of aggression, for example, as well. So now, do natural-born killers exist? The answer to that actually begins with the research question. So to ask the right research question, we have to understand the field of behavioral genetics. And the assumption is that our behavior is somehow co-determined by our genes. And that field started to ask research questions about different kinds of human traits a long time ago. Francis Galton was one of the first one in his Hereditary Genius, already published in 1869. He has that idea that the sons of men who are eminent in a particular field are more likely to also be eminent. Now, we can already start asking a few questions here. What is eminent? Where are the women in that research? What's the study design? And also, what's the environmental role? Because he actually only talked to the upper class in Britain. Now, that, however, kicked off that whole nature-nurture debate, a debate that has created really hard lines also within criminology. What is responsible? Is it the gene or is it the environment? But it also led Galton to define the basic of eugenics, which described, and here I quote, the study of all agencies under human control which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations. Now, that, of course, found some sort of interest in the Nazis. So due to that, this idea of eugenics went out of fashion for a while. But if we now fast forward, John Fuller and William... Now, I'm really kind of struggling with this. Yeah, hello, are you here? John Fuller and William Thompson reactivated that field in the 50s and 60s with an article and a book called Behavior Genetics. And that's already more refined. Genetic influence exists, but it differs, and we also need to restrict generalizations. Still, the importance of the family is still a vantage point for studying those common traits. Now, many designs exist to explore whether behavioral traits are inherited from parents, and many of these things I actually learned also from a lecture series a while ago, but I tried to recap them. First and foremost, there's adoption studies. So the idea is that I have a mom and I have a child, and I separate them, and then I see, do they actually have the same type of behavior? But there are a range of aspects that adoption studies do not really take into account. For example, that a baby is exposed to prenatal hormones in the body of the mom. The blood flow in the womb even makes a difference. We have also paternal uncertainty, meaning that we cannot ever really say, is the dad of the child that we thought? And then was actually the field of adoption matching, or this idea of adoption matching, that you would put a child into a family that would almost be, similar to the one that it would come from. So we could ask many questions here. Also, what does a separation of a baby do directly after birth, and so on. Now, the next point was then, well, twins could help out here. At best, monozygotic or identical twins, because they almost have the same set of genes. However, can you control for similarities or differences in the environment? Which environments that they have are shared, so they have them really together? What are non-shared environments that are unique to each twin? Are they really exposed to the same environment? And again, the environment also starts pre-birth, and it's fascinating. Even when kids are in the womb, the monozygotic lie. This is also determining how they're connected to, for example, again, the blood flow and what kind of sorry, I have to kind of go back to this because this doesn't really work here. What kind of environment they get in the mother's birth. So there's some sort of general study issues with studying twins. Do the population sample sizes even make sense? You need to have quite a few pairs of twins to be able to say something meaningful about them. Are twins even representative of a larger generation? So at best, then we have multiple studies to confirm results, but what if they're done by the same researcher with the same biases, for example? A new grasp would then, of course, be the environment, the role of epigenetics. Not only do both environment and the genes have an influence on trait expression, but they actively influence each other. You can actually no longer really talk about the two in a separate fashion. But how do they work in unison? How do they influence each other? That's a big question. So in order to take epigenetics into account, you also need to control for the environment again. And here it turns out that it's not necessarily important to have a particularly stable environment, but that you should try out your different experiments in different environments, because by controlling the environment in one stable environment, you would definitely overfocus on the genetic influence, because the gene may express itself in different environments differently. So, very quickly, what about animal studies? Well, they're possible, but some argue that the influence of genes are misguided when we study them in other species, because they're less complex, or they're in environments that are not really the same as humans share, or basically environments that mean something else to them as they mean to humans. While being busy with all these large cohort hereditary research, things have happened on the DNA sequencing front. So since a few decades, we can sequence larger amount and more in different types of data. And with massive parallel sequencing, that already tells us there's a lot of genes in there. As that term expresses, we can sequence much more than those areas in the so-called non-coding regions of the genome. So we can create big genome data that also includes information on the coding regions. And that is information about the parts of the genome that not only identify us, they usually sit in those so-called non-coding regions, but they actually do something, right? And this allows for new ways of tracing which gene and which so-called SNPs, I'm going to call them SNPs in this talk. So it's these very tiny parts here in the DNA that actually have an impact on how we behave. So a phenotype, also just to clarify that word, refers to observable characteristics. Some of them are how we look, others are apparently how we behave. So now, since both more data can be produced and more databases exist that give us data sets to work with, genome-wide association studies emerge. And in here, I want to explain to you how they approximately work. So if we look at this, say I would have the Norwegian population. Say I would sequence everyone's genome in this country, which is never going to happen, but we would do this. And then we would find out, okay, we have a range of hair color in this country from brown to blonde, all sorts of hair color. And we have all sorts of eye colors. And then what we would do is that we would actually compartmentalize them. We would say, a researcher would have to say, okay, let's define what counts here as blue. Where does blue start? Where does it stop? And then we have to do the same thing for green and for brown. And we would have to also, you see already here, there's little lines. We would have to define which type of blonde is which type of blonde, and so on and so on. So not only do we have all that information about all the people that I have screened, but we also know their genome. So what is happening in these genome-wide association studies is that I simply have that database, and then I can try to correlate things. I can also associate things with an algorithm to see, okay, it seems like that everyone with this hair color actually goes back to this type of SNPs or to this type of gene. So basically, I make an inference from that huge database. Now, SNPs or SNPs have some predictive power, especially when we look at phenotypes that follow pretty rough categorizations, such as hair color, for example. Now, but as we begin to realize what a trait really is, we may come to the conclusion that a single SNP may never be able to say anything about whether and how a trait is expressed, which means that we can also produce something called polygenic scores. Poly means several, genic, you understand. So I make scores of several SNPs. So the same is, it's the same, more or less the same thing that we do. We don't just look at one particular little thing here. We try to take account of several areas, of several SNPs. And then what we do is that we make a weighted mean and say, okay, so we put them all together and then we think, okay, so it seems to be that it's this combination of SNPs or genes or whatever you look at that actually creates an impact here. So we take account of more areas. And then we're at the point where we understand I can use this logic for most things. So if I only know the phenotypes, the trait that I would look at, and have a very large population or a large enough population, we can almost do anything. So that's why we actually get studies that look at voting behavior, going back to Trump, or our good old intelligence, like who's having what IQ and so on. We also can say maybe something about weapon use, and then suddenly we are asking ourselves whether we can actually research something as an antisocial phenotype. So you see that there are a few things that we need to understand to put the predictive power of these genome-wide association studies into perspective. So even though SNP-based predictions are based on enormous data sets and polygenic scores acknowledge that traits are an interplay of these different SNPs, there's still the issue of association, of correlative logics, of the idea that I always infer from something larger. I never really have an option to say this is causality, this is what causes something, but I only have an inference. I only ever have a database and then I land on a specific insight. So that's what I would call an associative logic, because I associate different data sets with each other. Now, this is why polygenic score, for example, is an estimate of how likely an individual is to have a given trait that's actually based on genetics. And yes, several SNPs or SNPs may affect each other in producing a trait, but since our main focus really lies on finding that SNP, or these SNPs, inferring them from a specific data set about traits and doing all that, means that's really hard to account for the environment again. So I can imagine that there are some studies that already bring that into that database of specific trait expressions in a specific environment and so on, but you're actually really sitting at the moment mainly in this database of, okay, I have a specific trait and I really try to identify that gene. So there's quite a focus on the SNPs. And though these genome-wide association studies include hundreds and thousands of data points, you can actually imagine how dependent our estimate about these SNPs is on the data that we have available. If my database is crap, like if I had, if I had only 3 people in my database about hair color, then obviously I will not be able to say anything meaningful about the hair color of a person and where it may come from. So all that said, I guess databases are growing and so on, so we get back to that. But set aside whether your data captures your assumptions really well, we have an even more urgent question to answer, and that's that we need to take a closer look at the ways in which complex phenotypes, such as behavior, it's really not a straightforward one, right, are even understood and operationalized when we run these studies. So what assumptions are built into a phenotype in the first place? So what is an antisocial phenotype? So in order to study it, you have to define its traits and what is gathered even under this phenotype. Do I put everyone who's diagnosed with antisocial personality disorders into that database? Yes, potentially. How is that disorder then again operationalized? That's something we need to ask ourselves. Antisocial behavior can be many things. Some define it as behavior that is in conflict with norms. Which norms? Whose norms? Some people say divorce is part of this. Well, by today we can ask ourselves, how many people do even marry each other? Then there's, you just name it, homelessness, addiction, drug use, low self-control, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, high school degree, back to our good old intelligence, all that. So how are all these variables then, again, operationalized? Where does alcoholism start? In which environment does alcoholism start? So many of these assessments follow a scientific protocol. I'm not saying that this is all, just really out there, but, they follow scientific protocol. They're based on established questionnaires that you can cite, and then they have the name of the person who have established the questionnaires. Everything. Basically, they have huge databases, all that science dreams of, and creates some form of stability in your research. And yet, every operationalization is a decision that's taken by a researcher. So please remember the hair color. That's a very simple kind of way of understanding someone makes these categorizations. So someone also needs to categorize all these complex traits. And that's why it is crucial for the field that they actually have a culture of critique, that they talk to each other, that they say, well, I see this differently, or, here we have a different type of trait coming in. They do have that culture. But there's still many open questions as to which assumptions about concepts such as normal and deviant behavior sit in the operationalization of all these traits. So in order to answer whether killers are natural-born killers, you need to be aware that already the decisions that you take in the definitions of your study are important, which means that behavioral phenotypes are not really a given set of traits that sits out there. Now, but operationalization, and I'm soon done with the sciencey part here, but operationalization is more than what goes into that actual phenotype definition. When you have landed on a set of variables that represent your antisocial phenotype, for example, aggression, you usually end up with an explanatory chain. And parts of that refers to natural sciences, part of that actually to psychology, and then you mix a bit of social science in there. So let me give you an example. For example, there's a strong research on the relevance of the so-called MAOA gene for aggression. I take that because it's been well studied, but also it had been misunderstood, and it has had an impact on the socio-legal system. So what's the chain of argument here? So the MAOA gene produces a specific enzyme which catalyzes neurotransmitters such as dopamine, things that calm me down. So if that activity of the gene is low, the dopamine production is low. So, which means that the regulation of your mood and your behavior is affected. Are you kind of impulsive suddenly? Are you having reduced empathy? Are you doing aggressive acts? And do you commit crime? You know, so our chain of argument goes here. I have a gene, and that's producing a protein. It makes a neurotransmitter. Well, that is kind of wrongly, you know, that's not working correctly. And then I have a certain behavior, and then I end up with crime. Now, what we need to be careful here is then how every single one of these associations are operationalized, again, how extensively they have been studied, and how are the elements of the chain put into relation to each other. That's something that I'm quite interested in. So one would expect that this gene enzyme neurotransmitter thing has been very well studied, right? But still, it's kind of interesting to know where they put their thresholds for stuff. So, and then we have that kind of, that connection here, neurotransmitter behavior. So that's already where your, you know, psychologist comes in and says, this is what aggressive behavior is, for example. And then we have that final jump, which is behavior leads to crime. And that, I would say, is probably the most debatable jump, because we would say, well, I mean, crime, doesn't it kind of also depend on the jurisdiction that you're in? And, you know, suddenly you have a lot of assumptions in there that are kind of dependent on, for example, different countries, what they consider crime and so on. So it's time for a little stock check here, just that we're kind of, you know, that we kind of collect what I've said so far. Do genes influence our behavior? Yes. Can we know how? Not always, but we can get a pretty good idea. The question remains as to ever we will be, if there's an option to capture and operationalize all those variables that we want to explore, not to speak of something as complex as the environment. But most people would say here, well, let's wait until we have some even more detailed study about that even more detailed part of the body that can tell us something here. We're going to get back to that. So, do natural-born killers exist? No, because this would be quite a dramatic simplification. So even quite a few geneticists would probably agree with me here. It's very hard to control these for all the variables in this study. It's unclear if a gene is actually expressed or not. We haven't really talked about that. Anyway, there's the environment that actually switches genes on and off and decides also how, you know, what we get to see, what the trait is in the end. But when I say simplification, I actually refer to something a lot more fundamental that is at play here, and that's a form, and then please bear with me, because then we're done with the really difficult stuff. So it's a form of philosophical reductionism that hides in that sentence, do not natural-born killers exist. So most quests for the genetic explanation of behavior follow a reductionist paradigm. And what do I mean by that? I learned that from a wonderful neuroscientist called Robert Sapolsky. I can very much recommend his lectures. So reductionism appears when we focus on identifying, for example, a polygenic index or a polygenic score for specific behavior with the expectation that all the different detailed pieces that we study can give us, in the end, one large whole. So the imperative here is the closer we look, the more precisely we can single out a gene and so on, the more likely we will be able to find the cause of a specific behavior. And in 90 to 95% of the time, this is a finding that actually holds true. So I set out to study a very particular, very narrow defined relationship, and there seems to be a functional connection in 90% of the cases that I have studied in my population. And once I have identified a connection that seems to hold true for most cases, I have another piece of the puzzle of the genes that make a large whole. So I am the sum of all those puzzle pieces. That's reductionism. However, these designs cannot really capture the complexity that otherwise characterizes nature. So we can kind of understand that as a principle that comes from chaos theory. So we know a starting state, such as a gene, but we cannot fully predict its future expression. Or we know a current state, yeah, and that does not necessarily tell us anything about, the starting state. There is a connection between the starting point and the end state, even a determinist connection, as Sapolsky would say, but the connection is super complex because you have to go step by step through these entire chain of connections, and every single connection is defined by a different rule. And that guides us in the end to something called emergence. Something new happens. So that is the beauty of complexity. You are not just, or we are not just, the sum of all the puzzle pieces. We are actually something more than that. What we are more than that is also really, really hard to, to follow. So these insights are really highly relevant for the criminal justice system. So let's say we know, start screening all babies at birth for MAOA. For that aggression gene. So we cannot really know whether a starting point, that gene, produces a particular outcome, let's say the use of a weapon. A gene screening cannot necessarily tell us what a human being maybe end up doing. So, and the same is true for the other direction. We cannot necessarily know whether a specific state, for example, the fact that I've used a weapon, was caused by a particular starting point, the gene. So a murder is committed, we cannot necessarily be tracing it back to a single gene. And that uncertainty is not really attractive for policy making, also not for most scientific cultures. Instead of seeking to grasp that complexity, reductionism sits in many study designs, right? I see a part, and if I know all the parts, then I know how things work. As I said earlier, in many cases, this is also meaningful. It's something that we do in medicine and other places, and we can make a meaningful connection in many cases. But another question then becomes really relevant, and given that our study was, say, operationalized beautifully, we have run many studies in many different environments, we have tested for our genes actually affect each other, we're aware of the political nature of all these, all these variables that we use. Given that we have run these extremely prudent and smart and encompassing studies, the question remains, what do we do with that knowledge? Now, how can we use it for society? And what happens when really well-organized but reductionist understanding of the genome's role in social behavior is translated into the public discourse? And here, I want to give you a few current scenarios. Now, the first one is direct-to-consumer services for genome testing. I think many have heard of the kind of the heritage testing. I want to know my ancestry, where do I come from, who is my long-term family, and so on. So that's a lot of kind of, especially American companies out there who try to offer you answers here. So, but this has moved on. People, or at least some places, give you, some services exist that give you an estimate of your behavior. Everything. You can even get your cosmetics kind of based on your DNA if you want to these days. So this is a place where typical co-option of research papers take place. And that, I think, is part because, this is, DNA is super interesting for us to understand our own identities and where is this going. So it also includes, for example, aggressive personality, as we have here. And what is really fascinating is that they even quote a study, and then they show us the study, and they say, look, this is legit. This is something that has really been looked at But then they really make that reductionist shortcut and say, here I offer you a service. They do that for all sorts of things. I thought it was really fascinating. Hypnotizability, leisure computer use, vengefulness, views on environmentalism. So be careful what you, maybe if you want to support the environment, it's just in your genes. So the slogan is basically, with a free DNA analysis, you can find out anything in your DNA that makes you, well, you. So I would say this is not popular science. I think this is populist science in the sense that we kind of give something to people that they kind of want to hear. So, and one issue is here, I mean, there's tons of issues with this, but one issue is here that the receiver of the results actually tends to believe potentially in what they're hearing, but also they share their data for all sorts of other genetic studies. So this is something to really be aware about. So what happened when research on aggression actually enters the public sphere? And it did. So there was a public debate specifically between 2012 and 2017 approximately, where these candidate and aggression genes have been put into society. And here we see it's actually from the BBC in 2014. And these MAOA discussions were pretty big there. But even media then present them in relatively curtailed version, which has large consequences for how we think about society, how we think of ourselves. Now, what happened more, it's not having an impact on how we think of ourselves, but actually it goes to court. So the MAOA gene has been going to the court. And that means it has also consequences for the justice system. Here is an article from Newsweek in 2019. This murderer claims he has the warrior gene, so that caused him to kill, and this is it. And then people have reacted to that, and a woman called Nita Farahani has run a lot of studies, over 1,500 judicial opinions that discuss the relevance of the gene and neurobiological evidence to bolster their criminal defense. And she concludes, yeah, there is serious criticism and justifiable concern by scientists, but it maybe also improves the criminal justice system because we have better competency determinations on the role of punishment. It's safe to assume that neurobiological evidence is now a mainstay, one of her big conclusions. Or not. Because here we have the Washington Post from 2021, still a gene for violence, it does not exist. So this is the moment where a little bit more refined research is coming into the public discourse. Well, potentially it went a little bit out of fashion, but I would say now that we have, it's also very much a child of the time, right? Because this was when the crime gene was big. Well, but now we have polygenic risk scores, and they're a little bit more detailed, and I think that may actually reinvigorate that entire discussion. But is that discussion only for lawyers and neuroscientists? Scientifically, we need to remember that most research is not making statements about individuals, but populations. That's really, really important to remember, that if we have a genetic behavioral study, it always talks about populations. It never says we're breaking this down to the individual. Can judges know the relevance of the explanatory power of this stuff? Actually, or of these type of studies? It's fascinating. I mean, there's already a lot of discussion going on whether judges can understand the explanatory power of DNA in terms of, like, have we found the right person? Have we found the right match? Right? But this is highly, highly complex stuff. And can judges even follow that, understand that? How dependent is a lawyer's rhetoric on the use of such arguments? For whom is this, in the end, a good? For whom is it a bad argument? A good argument, clearly, for those who try to get the sentence down. Bad argument for those who get to look at recidivism. The idea is that you may actually kind of commit a crime again, and there's risk scores for that, and if that genome idea then kind of enters those, then it's probably not good for use in order to kind of get a lower risk associated with you. Then we're cascading even more. We're talking about justice. Once this is established, what are the consequences for just treatment? Well, as Farahani said, it can actually also replace shoddier inferences, but what stops us from holding genetics against people? A little bit in this idea of like, if your risk assessment is then, not turning out so well for you because you have the right or the wrong gene. Now, we're cascading even more further out from the justice system. Society and societal organization, what does it do to health treatments, insurances, privacy, right? Who is even then having access to your genes all the time? And prevention programs. Are we all going to be put into prevention programs because we have the wrong genes and so on? Now, philosophically, and I'm not going to really take you there, but philosophically, you can also ask the question in the end. So this is a form of questioning then responsibility and free will, and, I have done it because I have the gene and so on. I saw some smiles when I mentioned prevention programs. Bam! So, should we screen kids' brains and genes to ID future criminals? That stuff existed. That was actually a discussion, again, between 2012 and 2017 when that warrior gene was discussed. And, then we're actually applying it to children, one of the most vulnerable groups on this planet. So it's kind of an interesting move. And then we have this point down here. They're trying to refine it. Yeah, it's difficult, but maybe let's think about it anyway. Maybe we can translate it somehow anyway, but think about privacy and so on. But the larger implications here are really not so well discussed in some of these open discourses. But then here, China calls off its controversial hunt for the Chinese warrior gene in children. Well, but then there's this little sub-sentence here. Well, rather, it wasn't the ethical issues that stopped this. It was really like it didn't work out. So for informing prevention programs, we don't even really need to say that the gene determines everything, but the gene is something that we manage. It's casually coming into society as in like, you have this predisposition, let's try to give you that type of treatment. We're managing this. So one could say that such programs should be developed for doing good. We actually have someone in behavioral genetics, a lady that has come with a book, The Genetic Lottery, Catherine Page Harden, who argues social policy should also consider genes. Now, the introduction of any genetic argument into politics and policy, especially criminology, can, and this is just a reminder, cause overstatements and misinterpretations. They can bring about categorizations and so-called types, because there's always, as you remember, people that need to define types, but also types in the end from who's then actually getting that treatment, where's that threshold for those who are eligible for a certain treatment or not. Stigmatization, of course, is a part of this, and something that I'm personally very interested in is this idea of which type of body then are we supposed to have in society. Is it a body that has the right nutrition, that has done some training? All of this is part of the discourse, right? Has a good hormonal balance? Are we not hyperactive? Very important. Hopefully you're not hyperactive, because that apparently is a real big deal. Now, future scenarios, and this is, I'm closing in. There's a trend, generally, that there is a rise of genetic data in society. We could say it's growing, the amount, especially private actors have a ton of data, large amounts, and tech also gets cheaper. That means all that may actually, at the moment, a full genome sequence is really, really expensive, but I think this will develop. And I think actually also polygenic risk scores will become more normal. Though at the moment, I also have to say, I know that a few forensic scientists sit here. For the police, something like this is absolutely unthinkable at the moment, but I think on other societal level it will come in. So, and then I was wondering, well, maybe our genomic data will at some point become part of our algorithms. People like you also do this, a little bit of what is already happening on Spotify, if you so want to, if you understand the pointer. Now, then if we just extrapolate a tiny bit from that prevention idea, and we're staying within criminology, then the question is, will we have at some point something like preventive punishment based on genes? Well, we already have this idea of preventive punishment in society, namely that, well, there is this risk assessment, this person isn't really kind of doing too well, so maybe let's keep them in prison for a tiny bit longer. And it's actually a decision that's independent of the original sentence. So that part is kind of, yeah, just for security's sake, let's put them away for a little bit longer. And that actually is already something that's called preventive punishment. Some countries had to actually let go of it again because it is in conflict with law. But we see already that tilting going on, that potentially we should be, keeping them in prison a bit longer. Now, another one is CRISPR. Actually, and CRISPR is the gene scissors, so you kind of take out a specific gene and then you kind of re-engineer the gene, you recode it in the way by kind of, by taking stuff away and putting new stuff in, to put it very basic. So that's CRISPR. Now, I was fascinated to find this one article by a lawyer and a biologist already in, I don't quite remember when it was, 2016, that suggested that we should start thinking about this idea of using CRISPR on people with the warrior gene. So should we go and start snipping around in the gene of people and try to engineer them not to be aggressive? So again, very much a child of its time, because the idea is here that we have that gene. I think that has become more complex over time, and I think we will understand that. But I found, what is this really? What questions does this really raise? It raises the question: what place should genes have in the debate about crime policy, and what are steps that states and societies and individuals are actually ready to take? Talking about individuals, what happens when this type of screening goes into reproductive assistance and population management and so on? So what if there's no longer our own choices whether we should be screening kids at birth for specific dispositions that also include behavior? What if this decision is taken by states, or at least pushed on you as in maybe you should be making that assessment? So how much can individuals and societies and states together navigate and understand such screenings even that would have major consequences for all of us? So, and then one of the big ones, and really I promise I'm coming to an end, is of course, what happens if all of that information and that knowledge ends up in the wrong hands? It already does. This is how Trump's quote continues, and we've got a lot of bad genes in our country right now, and he's cracking down on them. I mean, there is this idea that, no, actually, immigrants, they're all criminal, we're taking the DNA. Well, I mean, it's just for potential future matching, we're putting it into the big FBI's database, not everyone, but, it's going on. So the idea is here, there's already a trend going on. I don't know what other means he would have for, and here I quote him, cleansing the bloodlines and so on. But we're already at a point where genetic data can end up in the wrong hands and can be violated and misunderstood. And this is something we need to be aware of. To close, it's time for conclusions. I think knowing all of this now, I would say that most behavioral geneticists are very clear that gene expression is highly complex. I don't think there's very many out there that go like, bam, here's the gene, this is how you behave. So I think there is this understanding of complexity. And though we find studies within behavioral genetics that offer some predictive values, the question is still always, what's the politics that sit in these studies? And when I say politics, I don't mean just that they're informed by or will inform politics, but what I'm saying is that every norm that you somehow, behavior is, we behave according to specific norms also. Every norm that you operationalize, as I tried to explain earlier, is a decision. And the decision is, in some way or the other, a political decision, because you take decisions about where a certain behavior starts and ends. And that's actually not really just my thinking. This is also Richard Lewontin, famous geneticist in the 1980s, has already said all decisions taken in study designs are political. There's no such thing as unpolitical genetics research. And especially genetic studies of social behavior need to be assessed in terms of these sociopolitical assumptions they represent and the social impact they have. So while some research projects are really crucially important, and I really don't want you to misunderstand that, they're very important because they show the complexity of the genome. Imagine we would have never gone past Galton. So, you know, this is very, very important that we have these this research going on because it provides nuances. But I think talking about that crime gene means that we're making very sweeping statements. We should probably not use titles in our research papers of natural-born killers, which is actually a title, as I said, for something that is so highly complex and also a sensitive phenomenon. And this is where I would stop.
Tusen takk for et kjempeinteressant foredrag og veldig viktig tema å få løftet opp nå. Og så kan man kanskje prosessere, du snakker om warrior gene, men at det på en måte alle har det genet, men det den variasjonen da, innenfor genet som spennende å studere, at det forskjellige varianter.
Ja.
Ja. Det et kjempeviktig tema. Jeg skal ha en liten reklameavslutning før vi avslutter helt. Vi har 7. mai så har vi et nytt frokostforedrag som når familiearven en sykdom. Og da har vi fått Ida Vig Sørensen, som overlege ved medisinsk genetikk ved Haukeland, til å komme og holde foredrag om genetiske undersøkelser på norske sykehus og etiske problemstillinger knyttet til det. Så det kommer til å bli veldig spennende. Ja, da sier jeg tusen takk.
No questions.